I hope you have had a good week. It's nice to have some cooler weather and even a little bit of drizzle rain from the bright heat that we've been having over the last several months. So we praise God for that. So glad that you are here, either with us in person or watching and worshiping from home. I thought I would wear my USC jacket in honor of the Pac-12 football coming back next week, and so we look forward to that. And I was thinking this morning that when people see me, they're going to see I have like this little red scratch on my nose. And then I thought, well, I have my mask on, so maybe they won't see me. But that red scratch is from my little kitten that we got a few weeks back. And she came in the bedroom about 5 o'clock this morning thinking it was time to play. And I thought it was time to sleep. And I got one of her playful claws right across the nose. So that's why I look like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer this morning. So this morning I want to talk to you about another lesson in our series that we've been doing from time to time, and that is on the origins of life. We're not going to go through all of this morning. I've got my timer set. We'll cut it off in time here. But to me, this is such an important series of lessons, some important reminders, and maybe even some new information that you had never encountered or never thought of before. I want Christians, especially our young people, to know, whether they decide to go into college or just go out into the world as an adult, I want them to have confidence in their faith and knowledge of an intelligent designer named Yahweh. I want them to feel secure in that when they are ridiculed and put pressure upon and made fun of and made to be felt like that somehow they're lunatics and crazy, that they believe in God and miracles and the Bible. And I want us to understand that there is tremendous, especially in our day and age, a tremendous amount of evidence pointing to the reasonableness of a belief in an intelligent creator named God. There's an incredible amount of evidence that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be. And there is great evidence that the Bible is not just a product of man, but that it is what it claims to be, the inspired revelation Word of God. We've subtitled this lesson, What Takes More Faith? The old answer or the new answer? I'm hoping that you'll see, even though it is not taught this way to our young people, that the new answer, this macroevolution, takes a lot of faith. There's a lot of things that there's absolutely no proof of, there's absolutely no evidence, there's absolutely no answer for, and they don't like to talk about those things. They like to start in the middle. They don't like to talk about the beginning of things, and when they do, they don't like to separate the fact from the theory, the evidence from the opinion. They like to talk about it as fact, but a majority of it is opinion, it is theory. And I want our young people to understand that that's what they're getting. And so, I want to start off with a couple of passages that I think fit well with what we're going to talk about this morning. And the first one is in Hebrews chapter 3 and in verse 4, where the Hebrew author writes these words, "For every house is built by someone, and the builder of all things is God." I think that first line is exactly in line with what we've been trying to demonstrate. We look at a house, right? And it doesn't matter if it's this magnificent mansion of a house or if it's a ratty old shack. We look at it and we say, somebody built this. And why is that? Because there is complexity to some degree. There is thought and process and function. There is order to it. There is evidence that this wasn't just something that happened by chance and circumstance, that every house has a builder, a designer. And I love the Hebrew author because in this last line, his idea as he looks at this world, even in the ancient times and biblical times, his view of everything that is built around us that has much more complexity than a house, much more orderliness, that runs like a well-oiled machine. He says, but the builder of all things is God. And I say amen to that. That's what we're trying to show the evidence for. In Psalm 139 and verse 14, the psalmist says to God, I will give thanks to Thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are Thy works, and my soul knows it very well. What we're going to look at today, I believe, is some of the great evidence that shows us as human beings, God's creatures, and all around us, that it is all fearfully and wonderfully made. And I want Christians to know that. And I want non-Christians to contemplate it and challenge themselves in it. And I want you to know it all the way down to the depths of your soul, as the psalmist says, my soul knows it very well. Again, to that I say, amen. So, as we talk about this debate about the old answer in scientific terms, an intelligent designer, or the relatively new answer that's come about because we don't like the old answer of macroevolution, what we want people to understand is that we want them to consider this evidence, much like we do in a courtroom. In a courtroom, you have two sides that have two theories. You have the prosecution and you have the defense. And you've called into judgment to look at the evidence, to contemplate both of those theories, a judge, or in a lot of cases, most cases, a jury. And that's what we want you to be. We want you to be the judge or the jury. And so on one side you have the intelligent design, and on the other side you have macroevolution. And what happens oftentimes is that one side will bring in evidence that they hope will be contemplated and shown as what? The most reasonable, more reasonable to believe in theory A rather than theory B. And sometimes the other side will just ignore that evidence. They won't do anything with that evidence. And that in itself can be an evidence. That's something in itself to be, why don't they have an answer for that? And that happens for both sides sometimes in this debate about the origins of life. But what we're going to talk about this morning is something that often happens as well, where one side brings up the evidence and both sides use that evidence. But they bring out two separate points or different points from that evidence. And so it's the same evidence, and the jury has to ask the question, which is more reasonable, theory A or theory B, given the evidence? And so what we're going to look at today is an evidence that the one side of an intelligent designer uses, and they look at it and they say, it is most reasonable to believe that there's design involved in this evidence. Which remarkably, the macroevolution uses that same evidence and say, no, it points to this. It's most reasonable that this all shows this macroevolution. So I want you to look at this and see which is more reasonable. given this particular evidence that we look at today. So what is it that we're going to look at today? I wanted to do one that turned into 2 lessons on this remarkable thing called genetics. We got a room full of people. None of you look alike. You all have different features, different color eyes, different lengths of hair, color hair, and tall, short, and all of that. And it all comes from genetics, what we call DNA. What is DNA? I don't know if I can even pronounce this. Ribonucleic acid. That's why I never did good in science. You'll notice that I did capitalize nucleic. It's all part of one word, but I wanted to emphasize the DNA, where you see that in that. I'm going to show you what DNA is. This is from Wikipedia, but even in the explanation of what DNA is, something that was discovered not too long ago in the Genome Project, there's complexity even in the trying to explain what DNA is. DNA is a molecule composed of 2 polynucleotide chains that coil around each other to form a double helix carrying genetic instructions for the development, functioning, growth, and reproduction of all known organisms and many viruses. DNA and ribonucleic acid are nucleic acids, according to Wikipedia. Anybody want to explain that? I mean, look at that explanation of what DNA is, and is it reasonable to believe that something that complex just happened by chance and circumstance? When you see the complexity of it and the orderliness of it, and when you learn more about how DNA works, it is remarkable. It is a well-oiled machine that takes place inside of our cells. It is basically that which determines what we look like, inside, outside. Here's a picture of it. We'll take a look at more of it. But it's basically these amino acids that attach themselves, and it's kind of like a ladder that spirals. If you're able to see it that down in the cell level, which is incredible we can today. And the fact is that the deeper we look at life and the functions of life, all the way down to the cell level, the more scientists are having to admit, because they see it and they can't deny it, that there is great complexity, not less. Great orderliness, not less. Great organization, not less. The more we learn from it in a scientific way, the more we see evidences of what we would say is design. And I want Christians to know that. But this is one evidence that both sides use. And so I want to read a quote from Bert Thompson, an article that he writes. He has for years put out this little periodical called Reason and Revelation. I have quite a few of them in my library. Looked it up, and great article on this DNA. I want to just read a couple quotes. Here is the side of intelligent design. He's actually quoting from Dr. Wilder Smith and his important observation. And so Dr. Smith says, now, when we are confronted with the genetic code, that's DNA, we are astounded at once at its simplicity, complexity, and the mass of information contained in it. One cannot avoid being awed at the sheer density of information contained in such a miniaturized space. When one considers the entire chemical information required to construct a man, elephant, frog, or an orchid, that it was compressed into two minuscule reproductive cells, one can only be astounded. Only a subhuman could not be astounded. And I want to read another quote. This one is from Bert Thompson in the article. He says, second, the genetic code, again DNA, with its complexity, orderliness, function, provides the most powerful kind of evidence for intelligent design, which requires a designer. I want you to notice here is a man that looks at DNA from a very, very scientific, a very expert approach. And he says, when you look at it, what do you see? There it is again. You see complexity. You see orderliness. You see function. It provides the most powerful evidence for intelligent design. And when you see that intelligent design, then what's the next? Well, there has to be a designer. And this is why we talked about from the very beginning that macroevolutionists do not want to say, let's have both of these together. Let's discuss both of these together, because you open the door for intelligent design and you say that has intelligent design, you're opening the door to the designer, and they won't do that. Just like the Pharisees would not open the door that Jesus cast out demons by the power or the finger of God. DNA. I don't know about you. I remember we didn't know a whole lot about it. 1980s, 1990s. I remember the O.J. Simpson trial where they brought out DNA evidence. But it wasn't something that lawyers used often because we didn't know what it was and how exact it was and how it can identify someone so well. Where today, you hear this crime show and he says his DNA was found all over the weapon, all over the room, all over. You're like, oh, it was him. It's convicted people beyond any reasonable doubt. It has set criminals in jail free because DNA was linked to someone else, not them. But I remember in the O.J. Simpson trial, it didn't have a very big factor because no one really knew how exact and how incredible this type of evidence is that is today, that has overturned so many convictions and yet solidified others. And I don't know if we know what we know about today about DNA back then, if the O.J. Simpson trial would have had a different conclusion. I'm not sure of that. But I'm sure it would have helped the prosecution a lot more. And so here we have one that looks at this and they see the complexity, the orderliness, the function, the organization, and they say it has to have a designer because it shows all the characteristics, even more than a house, more than a computer, of intelligent design. Now, I want to tell you that even though DNA, if we look at historic timeline, has been a recent discovery, and we come to know more and more about DNA and how it functions, I want you to know that the ancients, even in biblical times, understood genetics to a degree. They couldn't explain DNA and all that, but they understood that you can get a stronger offspring by mating a strong male with strong physical characteristics that you prefer with a female with strong physical characteristics, and the most likelihood is you're going to have a stronger offspring with better features. They understood that, and so that was all about the mating of those and trying to get that pure, perfect white, unspotted, full wool sheep, lamb, right? Well, there's that story in Genesis chapter 30 that shows this, that God gets involved with the DNA. You might remember the story where Jacob has served his 14 years for Rachel, and now it's time for him to start his own family and his own flocks, and so the labor of his wages, the wages of his labor, are going to come from Laban's flock. And so he is mating Laban's flock. And Laban says, you're going to get the weak ones, and I'm going to get the strong ones. And so as he mates the flock, Laban says, okay, those are the weaker ones. And so what God does is he takes the weaker ones and he makes them, through the DNA, miraculously makes them the strong ones. And Laban sees that and he says, no, those are mine, and you can have this group. And every time Laban switches it, God switches it. And so in the end, you have all these references to spotted and speckled, the less desirable, but they become the stronger ones because of God taking over the DNA and blessing Jacob with a strong flock and leaving Laban with the weaker one. So people understood genetics, even though they couldn't explain all of how it works scientifically in the DNA. But here we go. Here is some pictures of it. This is what it actually looks like. You might remember from science class. Here we have, if you kind of flatten it out, you can see the ladder effect. And very quickly, you might remember this. These are connections, these little letters of amino acids. And they come together and they make these pairs, and these are crucial in forming all of these genetic features. And here is more of a chemical connection, but you see the amino acids. And all this is brought together by the combination of 20 different amino acids. And so I'm not going to tell you how all of this works. I don't think I can explain all of it. But basically what this does is it splits. It unravels. And so you have half and half, and this half goes out and makes a copy of itself, and it goes out and it synthesizes and makes proteins, and it does all of its work. And then this copy of it comes back, or the original comes back, and they connect together. And this goes on in your body all the time that you don't even know it. And when that strand, that ladder comes back together, it's perfectly put back together, almost always. But in the one time it doesn't, when there's a mistake, when one of these pairs of amino acids gets changed, and the original pair is no longer the original pair, it's called a mutation. And that's what I want to talk about, is these mutations. Mutations are basically mistakes. And these mistakes are key to macroevolution. You see, let me talk about this. In order for evolution, macroevolution, to be true, you've got to take something like a fish and not only, improve its features genetically, right? But you have to have some big genetic change so that what? This fish can become another creature. It can evolve into something that what? Can leave the water and now live on land. And so you have to have not only a little genetic change, but you have to be able to have a big genetic change where this fin starts becoming a leg with these little claws. Where this big fishtail starts becoming this skinny, long lizard tail. How does that happen? Well, evolutionists have kind of try to come up with different answers along the ways. One of them is what's called the Hox gene, or genes. I'm not going to go into all of that, but basically it all goes back down to genes and mutations. And so what they believe is that given enough time, and that's the key, right? Given enough time, enough of these mistakes that are positive, that are good, will come about and eventually form this new creature. In other words, through these genetic mutations, one species can become another species. And that has to happen. That has to be true. They have to be able to show that happens, or evolution, macroevolution, just disappears. You see, evolution is all about mutations. So what are mutations? Well, they are changes within the DNA. They're mistakes. And they occur in two different ways. The one that we're talking about now is basically in replication, in reproduction, where the original pair is changed. That's how it happens a lot of times. You see these children born with these diseases or these defaults. It's by this mutation that's happened in reproduction. But it also can happen in life. As you live your life, environmental factors such as ultraviolet radiation can change the cell's DNA. So many of the cancers out there are caused by exposure to certain chemicals. You go to Home Depot, you see that sign that says, we sell certain products known in the state of California to what? Cause cancer. They got to let you know. Because if you have a long exposure to some of these chemicals, it can change your cell's DNA. It can cause mutations. And here's the thing about it. With rare exception, there are some exceptions, but with rare exceptions, mutations are bad. They're not beneficial. They're not good. They cause viruses, they cause defects, they cause diseases. They're not good. There are some exceptions where a mutation is beneficial. And if we went back to that fish lizard screen, not only would you have to have these big mutations changing a fin to a leg, but those changes have to be beneficial. They have to be something that helps that creature survive. That's what evolution is. It's these positive changes. It's creatures getting stronger and better. Well, you can see when we put all of our eggs in the basket of mutations, and 99% of mutations are bad. Not only are they bad, they can be lethal. They can cause death. 1% are beneficial. Well, that's why what? You've got to have a lot of time. A lot of time. And so you have, basically, if I understand it correctly, they believe you have a good mutation, bad, 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 good mutation, bad, 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 good. And given enough time, those good ones survive, right? Survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest gets rid of all the bad ones. They don't survive, and you're left with the good ones. Now, is that more reasonable to believe that process happened? Chance and circumstance. You know, sometimes we talk about evolution is all about chance and circumstance. Well, what is the chance and circumstance? That's it. That's what we're talking about. That's the chance and circumstance. Eventually, you're going to have enough good ones that survive that a fin turns into a leg. Now, is that more reasonable to believe that, given this evidence, or is it more reasonable to believe that this DNA, what? Changes creatures within species, but not from one species to another? Is it more reasonable that the design has changes within a species, but not without a species? And we're getting at exactly what I want to come across. You see, the problem with evolution is not the word evolution. Okay? Sometimes I explain this, and it confuses people because, let's face it, we have been taught the word evolution is a bad word. It's evil. It can never be used in a good context. Well, sometimes people are surprised when I say, someone asks me, do you believe in evolution? And my answer is yes and no. Well, how can it be yes? Well, my answer to that is it all depends on what kind of evolution you're talking about. You see, evolution basically means change, and with that, we think of it as a positive change. And that's what it is. Well, do we see changes in species? Yeah, we do. Let's not deny it. So, when we understand that, the problem with evolution is not the word evolution, it's the word macro. What's macro? Macro is large. It's big. It means a large scale change. In other words, that one species can then change genetically to form another species. That's a big leap. That's a macro change, right? And the problem with that is that there's no evidence of that. So the problem is not evolution, it's macroevolution, and that's why since the beginning I've been trying to deliberately use that term macroevolution. Most of the time when we talk about evolution, we're talking about macroevolution. But there's another kind of evolution, microevolution. Small evolution, small changes. And we see it every day. Here's a good example of it. If you brought your dog to the park, and you brought your dog to the park, and you brought your dog to the park, we wouldn't be confused as whose dog is who because they look different, right? They don't look the same. Why is that? Because in genetics, in our DNA, there is variation. And so you have big dogs and you have small dogs. You have hairy dogs and you have hairless dogs. You have dogs that slobber all over. Yuck. And you have dogs that don't slobber, but they just go. It's DNA. It's genetics. Let's not deny the facts. Microevolution is a fact. You can see it. You can manipulate it. Even the ancients understood it. But what we don't see is macroevolution. A fish turning into a lizard, one species turning into a lizard. That is theory. That's assumption. And I want our young people to understand that. There's no evidence that one species becomes another. They tell you all the time. You go to the zoo and you say, this is the ancestor of this animal or so forth. You see it in museums, but that's a whole lot of theory written as fact. They want to tell us that one species can become another species through genetic mutations. But there is a book that we love with all of our heart, we live by, that tells us exactly about microevolution. It's the Bible. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 24 and 25, then God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind, and it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind, and God saw that it was good. Notice the repeated phrase there, after its kind. The same thing is said with the plants, the trees, the vegetation, the sea creatures, the insects, and the land creatures. They reproduce after their kind. It doesn't mean they all look the same. God is built within, the designer has built within the genetics, the DNA, the ability for small-scale changes. And it's incredible to think about the billions of people who have been on the face of this earth, and not a single one or two pair of them have ever looked exactly alike. Even identical twins aren't truly identical. Can that just happen by chance and circumstance? Can that just happen by genetic mutations? Or does that show design, intelligent design? You see, microevolution we can see, but macroevolution is a whole different thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but not only do we have a problem with this genetics where only 1% are positive, but we have a problem of seeing these creatures in between. Where are what we call these intermediates? Where are these in between? Where are these evolving creatures? Where do we find them? We don't. That's a part of the evidence that's either made up or that macroevolution they don't do anything with. They don't bring that up. Or they make it up and they'll see an intermediate form in something that clearly is just a well-established creature. And so we're going to put our pin there. And we're going to talk a little more about these mutations. Here's what it is. You can see the original sequence of the amino acids there. And then what happened? A point mutation. The T turns into a C. It's a mistake. But I'll tell you what is not a mistake is to believe in that intelligent designer we call Yahweh. I'll tell you what's not a mistake is looking at the evidence and saying it not only is more reasonable, it seems like the only answer that's plausible, that He is our intelligent designer. I'll tell you what is not a mistake is trusting the Word of God to be the revelation of Yahweh, pointing us to where we went wrong, sin, and how we can correct that through Jesus Christ and His sacrifice. By following His plan of salvation and become a Christian. And if anything that we say that you hear, number one, if it hasn't struck you yet, let us help you to become that child of God, to stand on the truth, on that solid evidence that we'll just keep bringing out. But if you are already a Christian, and I hope that this has just brought more confidence in your faith and stirred up that faith in wonderful ways, I hope you'll think of someone that maybe you've had kind of a discussion with, or you see that they like to talk about these things, and maybe broach that subject with them. The evidence of an intelligent designer. To reason with them that is very reasonable. It's very plausible that we are all here because of an intelligent designer, a creator we call Yahweh. Thank you so much. We'll begin our song service at this time.